Hey folks, Dale Jackson here. Let's talk for just a quick second today about how ridiculous the media's coverage has been of everything that has happened involving Bubba Copeland. Now, you can be outraged that Bubba Copeland was driven to suicide by 1819 News. You're not right, but you can hold that position. What you can't do, if you're honest with yourself, is pretend that there was no newsworthiness in the coverage. Because that's just a lie. And it's a lie that many in the media are telling themselves for one reason and one reason only. They're telling themselves that so they can justify not covering the story. And I've thought this entire time that there was newsworthiness in this story, and the attempts to downplay it even after his death are disingenuous at best. I'm not really the only one that has seen it that way, though. You have seen a couple media outlets actually push back a little bit against against AL.com's narrative and call them out for their dishonesty. Let's just put it that way. Alabama Today, April Marie Fogel, she wrote a piece where she lays out in detail how AL.com has taken this position, also known as the Alabama Media Group, has taken this position that 1819 News, because they're formerly owned by the Alabama Policy Institute, that they are somehow not a legitimate news outlet, which is not true. They're a news outlet with a conservative bent. That's very true. But so is Yellowhammer News. So is Alabama Today. And you can make the argument that that's the position they come from if you want to. What you can't do is ignore large portions of the story. In the original piece, written by 1819 News, Bubba Copeland's misdeeds were laid bare. And it goes far beyond wearing women's clothing. That was just a part of the story. A pretty substantial part of the story, because we had images that went with it. But there were more parts of the story. And in the original reporting by 1819 News, they pointed that stuff out. The erotic slasher fiction, where he used real names and real people. He was a pastor. That's out of bounds. He was a mayor. That's out of bounds. The use of a minor's picture in a meme about transitioning and becoming a whore. That's out of bounds as a mayor or a pastor. Posting, this other stuff was not in the original reporting, but those two things right there are bad enough. Now we've learned that he took women's photos and posted them on porn sites and things like that. But it was newsworthy from the jump. No question about it. No question about it. Outside of the transgender stuff. And by the way, the sole reason you have people on social media defending him is because they think he's transgender. That's it. And maybe he was playing a role online. Nobody knows for sure. But that's all that matters. Once he put that dress on, they could not out him for anything else or acknowledge anything else that he did wrong. Because if they did, what it would do is make it appear that he was mentally ill. And they don't want to do that. Because of the stigma that comes with being mentally ill and transgender. Bubba Copeland will be referenced a lot over the next couple of years in Alabama. Anytime an LGBTQ bill comes up, they'll say, well, see, this is what drove Bubba Copeland to suicide. It will be said on the House floor in Alabama. You will hear a lot about it. But back to this piece by Alabama Today. They lay out basically how they've gone and just decided that this was a non-story. How 1819 News drove him to suicide. They've got a piece out at AL.com today talking about how anti-LGBTQ rhetoric led to this guy's death. No, this guy was doing shady stuff in his life and was being exposed. That's what led to his death. His own hand. And it is really unfair to 1819 News for them to be doing this the way they're doing it. There was plenty of questionable behavior going on by this individual, Bubba Copeland. So I was kind of surprised today to see this. An article from a regular guest on my radio and TV show, Cameron Smith, where the headline, I think is questionable. I told Cameron Smith this today. I think the headline is questionable, and one of the conclusions he comes to is actually kind of questionable as well. But that's a matter of opinion. He's an opinion columnist. I'm a talk show host. I am Alabama's most trusted journalist, but I am a talk show host. A different news outlet might have saved Bubba Copeland. And Cameron lays out, I think, a defense of 1819 News. Where what he says is, 1819 News covering this story was legitimate. And the stuff that he was doing was questionable. But this part, I think, sticks out. In hindsight, critics have argued that Copeland's suicide was a foreseeable result of 1819 News' negative attention. If news outlets can't report about public figures because they might harm themselves, they will have little real accountability. Media outlets regularly deem a public official's private life to be relevant and newsworthy, even if it's uncomfortable at times. That's the defense of 1819 News' reporting. They reference John Miller, Cameron Smith does, John Miller, and all that, or John Merrill, and all the issues the former Secretary of State had and how AL.com reported those. The conclusion he comes to at the end is that 1819 News needs to do better. He said, to borrow from scripture, 1819 News took a broad road with a wide gate instead of a narrow path, consistent with what many of them and their supporters claim to believe. It's hard to blame them for behaving like so many current media outlets. In times like these, we could use something different. So I tend to disagree with his, and this is a pretty long piece, but you should go read it at AL.com. I tend to disagree with the conclusion here that 1819 News should have written a different story or done it somehow differently. Cameron even goes into a point where they should have gone to his church and talked to them and told him what he was doing. That's not their role. Their role is to inform people what's going on. If my son was in that church and the pastor was doing that, I'd want to know. If I was giving money to that church, I'd want to know. If my mayor was doing these things, I'd want to know. This was clearly in the public interest. This didn't involve hacked emails or anything like this. This involved tips from citizens that led reporters to information that they confirmed was in fact the mayor. And then they reported it. They went to the number one guy, which was Bubba Copeland, and they ran with the story. 1819 News did nothing wrong. The people that did something wrong here is the rest of the media. Smearing reporters because they work for outlets they don't like. That's all this is. And you can't really find any other reason to fault 1819 News' reporting. Nothing in it's been disproven. Nothing in it's fake. He's a public figure, and they went and found public things. They went directly to him and talked to him about it. Bubba Copeland is responsible for what happened here. All the way around, from the beginning of the story to the end. His predilections, his issue. Agree with that. But people have a right to know that stuff. People have a right to know what's going on. Had it just been the dressing as a woman, maybe you could argue they shouldn't have covered the story. But that's not all that they found, and that's not all they published in their first story. So it's time for the Alabama media to own what they're doing here. They owe 1819 an apology. They should atone for their terrible behavior. And if they're acknowledging that the personal lives are off limits, how are they going to do their jobs? And the answer is they're not. They're patting themselves on the back for not covering the story. They're all using the exact same verbiage and leaving out the same details. So here are the facts. Bubba Copeland, yes, was a self-described curvy, transgender, transitioning girl. But he also abused the trust of the people in his church and the city by writing erotic slasher fiction involving real people, posting people's photos to porn websites, and using a minor's photo in a sexually suggestive meme about transitioning. Those are all newsworthy things. Do I expect the media to come around and come correct? Absolutely not. Because this is who they are. And this is why people hate them. And whatever your disdain is, whatever amount of disdain you feel for journalists and the mainstream media, it is not enough. They are the enemy of the people. They believe that if you have the right sexuality or gender identity or sexual kink, you should be ignored. We're going to see how far this exemption goes in the future when Alabama journalists have to do their job. My guess is it's all going to depend on whether or not that individual journalist or outlet agrees with the person they're covering. That's going to be the standard. That's not journalism. So just be clear. That's not journalism.